Assalamu alaikum. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lahu wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh. Amma ba'du, fa'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Allah the Almighty states in the Holy Quran, and if people have enforced His will, He would have made you all one people. But He wishes to try you by that which He has given to you. Vive then with one another in good works. To Allah shall you all return. Then He will inform you of that wherein you differed. Chapter 5, verse 49. Beloved Hazur, esteemed guests, brothers and sisters, and empty viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. We have been united here from all over the world with one goal and one aim, and that is to strive for peace, and in doing so, spreading the true message of Islam. Our faith, our belief, and guidance from Allah the Almighty has blessed us into the fold of Ahmadiyyat, and in doing so, it has become for us a fortress of peace. Today, I have been given the opportunity to discuss how, in the age of conflict and war and disorder, Ahmadiyyat has become a fortress of peace. The prime purpose of the advent of the promised Messiah al-Islam was to revive the true teaching of Islam in its pristine and original condition and unite the humanity of the world under one banner. The promised Messiah al-Islam said, and I quote, "I have come to re-establish the relationship between man and Allah that people of the world have forgotten." He also declared that jihad with the sword had ended and that there were to be no more religious wars to resolve conflict. In a world that seemingly is in a tug of war between world peace and nuclear warfare, the political, social, and economic balance of the world is more fragile than ever before. On one hand, we see civil wars breaking out throughout the world, whilst on the other hand, we see global leaders speaking out and campaigning against these wars. Due to the lack of morality and integrity of world leaders, often through promoting nationalism or self-interest, we are creating global conflict and war, which is leading to calamities and disasters foretold by Allah to the promised Messiah al-Islam. Allah the Almighty, as is His custom, first shows many signs in support of the truthfulness of the promised Messiah al-Islam. And when people continue in their opposition, Allah in His majesty told the promised Messiah al-Islam in dreams, visions, and verbal revelation of the calamities and disasters that were waiting for people. According to the Global Peace Index published in 2018, the global economic impact of violence was 14.76 trillion in 2017. The average level of global peacefulness has declined for the 4 consecutive years. Some commentators believe that United Nations was established to mediate state-to-state crises. The fact that certain countries in the UN have been granted veto powers immediately undermines the United Nations as a peacekeeping force, as countries use these vetoes for self-purpose. During his keynote address in the European Parliament in Brussels, His Holiness Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad Ayatollah bin Nasser Aziz, Khalifa and the international leader of the global Ahmadiyya Muslim community, stated, "The right of veto power can never allow or facilitate the establishment of peace, because clearly not all the countries are at an equal level." He further stated, "If we look at the voting history of the United Nations, we find that the veto power has not always been used to help those who are being oppressed or who are acting in a rightful way. In fact, we have seen that the veto power has, on certain occasions, been misused to help and assist in cruelty rather than to prevent it." It is not something that is hidden or unknown. Many commentators openly write or speak about this. It is tragic that even peacekeeping efforts are causing more distress than comfort. It is because the world has forgotten their Creator, and that beyond this life we will be accountable for our actions and deeds. In his book, Kashti-e-Nuh, or Noah's Ark, the promised Messiah ﷺ stated, "It is inevitable that you should also be tried with various forms of anguish and misfortune, just as the faithful before you were tried. Be on your guard, lest you should falter." So long as you have a firm relationship with heaven, the earth can do no harm. Whenever harm befalls you, it will be from your own hands and not from the hands of your enemy. Even if you lose all honor on earth, God will bestow eternal honor upon you in the heaven. So do not forsake him. The world is failing to recognize the urgent need for a true leader that can guide the world to peace. And lately it seems that particularly the Muslim world is suffering due to the lack of the true guidance and unity. There are some critics who argue that the Holy Quran recognizes human inclination for conflict, so gives permission for defensive wars. However, sadly today, due to a lack of understanding of the true meaning of jihad, Islamic jihadists have distorted this teaching to justify terrorist bombings. It has been mentioned in the Holy Quran that the followers should stay clear of such religious hypocrites. Allah the Almighty stated in the Holy Quran, chapter 2, verse 205 and 206, "And of men there is he whose talk on this life would please thee, and he would call Allah to witness as to that which is in his heart, and yet he is the most contentious of quarrelers. And when he is in authority, he runs about in a land to create disorder in it and destroy the crops and the progeny of man. Allah does not love disorder." This verse could reflect certain so-called religious leaders today who speak out in the name of peace but are responsible for conflict and bloodshed. Religion, unfortunately, can be used differently in the hands of power-hungry. Instead of being used for peaceful and selfless purpose, it becomes a vice for conflict and division. This is sadly why human conflict, unfortunately, involves religion. The promised Messiah ﷺ states that God, so described, is the fundamental bedrock of my community. Believe in him and give him precedence to him over your own souls and comforts and over all your relationships. Show sincerity and loyalty in his cause by exhibiting courage in your practice. Worldly people do not refer him over their means and their kith and kin, but you ought to, so that you may be counted in heaven as belonging to his community. Further, the Prophet ﷺ enjoins us, "O ye people who consider yourselves members of my community, you will be counted as such in heaven when you truly tread upon the way of righteousness. So offer the 5 daily prayers in such fear and with such complete attention as though you were actually beholding God the Almighty." This is the true message of Islam. We have seen in the past, when Islam was practiced in its true and beautiful form, the world was blessed with what the history notes as the Golden Era. Developments in this time paved the way for Europe's Renaissance and the Enlightenment era. Historians and commentators note that the innovations of the Muslims of this time developed the order of the algebra, our magnetic compass, tools of navigation, our mastery of pens and printing, and our understanding of how diseases spread and how it can be healed. These great discoveries were made because Muslims were practicing the 2 values of Islam, the values of the Holy Quran and the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. and this established the values of justice and peace. In the Holy Quran it states, "O ye who believe, be strict in observing justice and be witness for Allah, even though it may be against yourself or against your parent and kindred." And then again Allah calls to the abode of peace and guides whom He pleases to the straight path. The greatest example that encompasses all these teachings can be found in the founder of Islam, Khatam an-Nabiyyin, the seal of the prophets, the great Hazrat Muhammad Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It was the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, that once said, "Forgive him who wrongs you, join him who cuts you off, do good to him who does evil to you, and speak the truth, although it may be against yourself." He was a man who suffered great persecution, but he never promoted unmitigated violence against those who mocked him. He left a legacy that is recognized today by both religious and secular thinkers, and he recognized not only as a humble man whose character was exemplary, but also stood out as a just political figure. He was responsible for perhaps one of the most important political documents of history, the Charter of Medina. The Constitution or the Charter of Medina predates the English Magna Carta by almost 6 centuries. The Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam penned the Charter of Medina as a minority sovereign. This was the first ever charter of human rights found in documented history and forms the basis of the rule of law used today by all developed nations. This charter proved that true Islam was indeed a fortress for peace for all faiths, which is what the promised Messiah ﷺ has come to revive. In the words of his last sermon, the Holy Prophet ﷺ spoke of equality for all nations and races. He stated that the only thing that could be truly define us is righteousness. During the reigns of the Khulafa Rashidin, the 4 righteous Khalifas of Islam, the Muslim nations was a great example of peace and tolerance and acceptance of all. But sadly, this began to go into decline after the demise of the last righteous Khalifa. From then on, the Muslims became more and more divided. In the recent years, Islam has not only seen as a guiding light for peace, but in fact has become synonymous with war and discord. In the past 200 years, Muslims have not made history, but in fact have become victims of it. They have become lost in the dark ages that they guided the modern West out of. In a commentary written by Karen Armstrong of the Times, she summarized as such: "Contrary to popular belief, Islam is not addicted to war, and jihad is not one of its pillars or essential practices. The primary meaning of the word jihad is not a holy war but struggle. It refers to difficult efforts that is needed to put God's will into practice at every level, personal and social as well as political. A very important and much quoted tradition was that Muhammad telling his companions as they go home after a battle, we are returning from the lesser jihad, the battle, to the greater jihad, the far more urgent and momentous task of removing wrongdoings from one's own society and one's own heart. In this darkness, there's a beacon of hope, a shining light, a guide in the form of the promised Messiah, al-Islam, Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad of Qadian. In 1889, in a small town of Ludhiana, India, the promised Messiah gathered his followers together and established the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jamaat, the beginning of the revival of Islam. The promised Messiah al-Islam was a prolific author and wrote more than 90 books in various religious, theological and moral subjects between the publication of the first Brahine Ahmadiyya, the Proof of Islam, his first major work in 1880 until his demise in May 1908. He invited the mankind to the ways of God. True to the old tradition, only a few people, young, poor, and lowly, accepted this message initially. He was, however, given the glad tidings that his message would reach and be accepted far corners of the earth. Through revelation, Allah the Almighty told the promised Messiah Islam the world would go through dire calamities, but this salvation could be achieved by entering his fold. An example of this can be found in the book Kashti-e-Nuh, or Noah's Ark. This book contains the teachings of the Holy Quran, which by following human race can achieve salvation. At the time of writing this book, the Indian subcontinent was about to descend into the grip of a dire plague epidemic. This epidemic played havoc in India and claimed more than 10 million lives. Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad al-Islam spoke of the prophecy that mentioned such a plague would strike the land, and noted in Braheen-e-Ahmadiyya, first published some 8 years before the epidemic, the prophecy proclaimed that any person within the four walls of the Promised Messiah Islam who follows the teaching of his book would not die from the plague. The Promised Messiah stated, "Thus whosoever fully acts upon my teachings enters the house of mine, concerned with God the Almighty has promised in his words, that is, I shall protect everyone who is within the four walls of your home." This should not be taken to mean only such people who dwell in my house made of bricks and mortar. Rather, it also refers to all those who follow me completely and dwell in my spiritual home. This makes it absolutely clear the meaning of Ahmadiyya, the fortress of peace, is not just a definition, but an extended metaphor of the revelation that the Promised Messiah Islam received in this connection. In other words, Ahmadiyya can only be the true citadel of peace if we, the followers, are truly devoted to the mission of the Promised Messiah Islam. This can only happen if we truly believe and follow the true teaching of Islam. It appeared that following these teachings was better protection against the plague rather than the vaccination offered by the British government of the time. People in large numbers joined the Jamaat during this time and escaped death. He also predicted many other important events, including world wars, dire earthquakes, and the fall of the Russian Empire. In his book Kashti-e-Nuh, the Promised Messiah Islam states, "The heavenly prohibition is that God in this age desires to show a heavenly sign of his mercy to mankind. Addressing me, he said, 'You and those who dwell within the four walls of your house, those who unconditionally follow you and are obedient to you, and who, on account of true righteousness, have become devoted to you, shall all be safeguarded against the plague. There will be signs of God in the latter days, so that he might demonstrate a distinction between people. But those who do not follow you completely are not of you. Be not anxious on their account." It was noted that on the 4th of May 1904, Maulvi Muhammad Ali, MA, manager and editor of the Review of Religions, became indisposed. He had a headache and felt that his temperature was rising, and he suspected that these might be symptoms of the plague. When the Promised Messiah Islam was informed of this, he immediately visited Maulvi Muhammad Ali Sahib and said, "If you suffer from the plague while you are dwelling within my dar, my home, then the revelation received by me and all of our affairs would prove vain." He examined his pulse and assured him that he certainly had no fever, and this was confirmed by reading of the thermometer. The Promised Messiah Islam said, "I believe as firmly in the divine revelation that comes to me as I believe in the books of Allah."
Narae Takbir! Narae Takbir! Muhammad Mustafa, Hazrat Muhammad Mustafa, Ghulam Ahmad ki, Ghulam Ahmad ki, Narae Takbir.
Another sign which proved that Ahmadiyya's fortress of peace comes from an incident regarding the dire earthquake which took place in India in 1905. One companion of the Prophet Messiah, Mirza Barkat Ali, narrates, during the great earthquake in 1905, I was working as a clerk in the district of Kangra in the valley of Himalaya, and I was buried in a house from where I was rescued with great difficulty. There were many Ahmadi witnesses to that incident who were also working in the area. The promised Messiah, as had prophesied about the earthquake only 2 months before this occurred, and published a pamphlet which I had brought from Qadian to Dharmasala cantonment and distributed there to many people. We had many Ahmadi families working in government offices there, and in those days many Ahmadi visitors had come there to enjoy their spring holidays. Miraculously, all Ahmadis in the areas were saved and were unharmed by this great earthquake, although there was 90% loss of life in the area. I hope to write detailed accounts of this calamity and hope each Ahmadi remained unharmed was a great sign in itself. The Prophet ﷺ had already declared in his pamphlet that not one Ahmadi will be lost in that earthquake. And I'm sure that the Prophet ﷺ was informed about this by Allah the Almighty. And after my visit to Qadian, where the promised Messiah ﷺ personally heard and asked me many questions, Huzur declared this was a great sign and a miracle. Another sign shown by Allah the Almighty is that of a student named Abdul Karim. And I believe my previous speaker also mentioned this in his address. Abdul Karim had traveled all the way from Hyderabad to receive religious studies in Qadian. He was bitten by a rabid dog and was sent off for treatment. Initially, he felt better but then fell ill again, and eventually doctor said nothing more could be done for him. When the promised Messiah ﷺ was informed of this, he was saddened that a young man who had traveled long distance to come and study religion had fallen ill. He prayed most compassionately for Abdul Karim. The Prophet ﷺ said his mother had sent him to school with so many hopes. And the Prophet ﷺ's prayer cured Abdul Karim of something that had no treatment at the time. Throughout his life, the Prophet ﷺ dedicated himself to promoting peace, and because of this, the message of Ahmadiyyat becomes a fortress of peace, not just for those within the Jamaat, but those surrounding it. During his life, he sent messages to various religious and political leaders to invite them to the message of peace and unity and beckon them back to Allah the Almighty. Most notably, he wrote a letter to Queen Victoria on her Jubilee celebrations and delivered his message of true Islam and peace to the United Kingdom. The promised Messiah ﷺ had received many revelations, including, I shall safeguard all those who dwell in your house. Whosoever enters it enters peace. The house filled with our love is an abode of peace. His successors carried this message, and in doing so, the Jamaat continues to grow in leaps and bounds, and so gave birth to a great mind and believers who were held in great esteem, not just for their academic excellence, but their religious devotions. And the names that spring to mind are Hazrat Sir Chaudhry Zafrullah Khan Sahib and Dr. Abdul Salam Sahib, to name a few. Whilst members of the Jamaat have been celebrated by the world, unfortunately we've seen persecution of the community in various Muslim countries, particularly Pakistan. The Jamaat was declared non-Muslims in 1974 under the Bhutto government, and further legislation was brought in by General Zia, which meant the Ahmadis could not practice their faith openly in Pakistan. The result of this resulted in the migration of Khilafat from Pakistan to England. As with all great messengers mentioned in the Holy Quran, migration became essential when intolerance began to increase to an unreasonable level. Members of the Ahmadiyya community are fortunate that Allah the Almighty has bestowed on us the blessing of the institution of Khilafat. Each Khalifa, following the demise of the Promised Messiah, has devoted his life towards the fulfillment of the mission of the Promised Messiah. All can see how glorious the prophecy of I will cause the message to reach the four corners of the world is being fulfilled, and how Ahmadiyyat has been and is spreading throughout the world, which is evident at this Jalsa Salana. Every Khalifa has continued to guide the followers in the true path. Today we are blessed with the presence of the fifth Khalifa, Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad Ayatollah bin Rasul Aziz. Elected to his lifelong position on the 22nd of April 2003, he serves as the worldwide spiritual and administrative head of the international religious organization, with membership exceeding tens of millions across 212 countries. This was a figure that Hazur announced in his address yesterday. Hazrat Khalifatul Masih has traveled all over the world and addressed the highest forums on the importance of peace and justice. And in every address to the Ahmadiyya community, he has been guiding us, admonishing us, and pleading us to reform ourselves to the path of true Islam, the path followed by the companions of the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the companions of the Promised Messiah. On the 17th of October 2016, Zuri Anwar delivered a historic address at Canada's National Parliament in Ottawa. During his address, he spoke of the importance of peace and religious freedom. If peace cannot be established through dialogue, then other nations should unite together. Whosoever is perpetrating injustice and use force to stop them. Once the aggressor adopt peace, then they should not be humiliated or nor should unfair sanctions be levied upon them. Rather, in the interest of fairness and long-term peace, they should be permitted to move forward as a free society. Hazur has dedicated his life to showing the true and the wonderful benefits of Khilafat, what true Khilafat really stands for, instead of the misconceptions perpetuated by the likes of al-Baghdadi, who have used their platform to spread hate. Hazur has been a fortress of peace in the age that submerged the Muslim world into darkness, carried the torch of the Promised Messiah, and in doing so, bring people back to the light of true Islam. During the 39th annual Jalsa Salana in Germany, Hazur Aqdar stated, "The sole concern of Ahmadiyyat Khilafat is that people of the world come to recognize their Creator and bow down before the one God, and secondly, create the spirit of love and harmony amongst people of the world." This is the true message of Islam, a fortress of peace in the world that is heaped in conflict. The Promised Messiah in Ruhani Khazain states, "Oh, listen, all of you who consider yourself to be of my community. When you truly tread the path of righteousness, only then you will be counted in heaven as a community. So perform your prayers 5 times a day, inspired by such awe and awareness of the presence of God the Almighty, as if you were seeing Him with your own eyes." The Promised Messiah further stated, "Remember, there is no deed of yours which is devoid of righteousness will be entertained by God. An act of goodness is the only one which is rooted in the fear of Allah. No act in which this rooted remains intact will be permitted to go to waste." As I've said before, under such circumstances, Ahmadiyyat is going to be the only citadel of peace and hope, provided we prove ourselves to be worthy of this responsibility. We must prepare ourselves for this onerous task and prepare our future generations in light of the injunctions of the Promised Messiah and the exhortations of the Khulafa. Due to the shortage of time, I'd like to end with this prayer. May Allah enable all of us to follow these blessed teachings and continue to enjoy the blessings of Ahmadiyyat, our fortress of peace, and may it become salvation for all mankind. May the message of Ahmadiyyat bring world peace and guide humanity back to its true Creator. May Allah continue to bless the institution of Khilafat and its mission to spread the message of Ahmadiyyat to the four corners of the earth. Ameen. Praise belong to Allah, the Lord of the world. Jazakallah.